Hey guys, welcome to Triangle School. I'm Josh Mooney. I got my buddy Mike here. Today we're going to be talking about transitioning from the side control to the scarf. The scarf has been a really important piece of my game. It's allowed me to tie together a lot of the pieces of my side control game that might happen from different different variations of side control.
So, I got Mike in side control. I'm blocking his hip with my knee. I'm blocking his floating rib with my elbow. I've got an underhook, and I have a crossface over here. Mike has done a good job of framing against my hip right here, which means I can't put my weight on him from this position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach back, and I'm going to grab his elbow. I'm going to push his elbow into his body by bringing my head forwards. It's very important that my hips stay low when I do this. If my hips start to come up when I do this, Mike's going to be able to carry my weight across his body, and I'm going to get rolled to the bottom. So I keep my hips nice and low, I bring my head forward, and I compress his elbow into his body. Now I'm going to sit past this frame, and I'm going to bring my knee next to his shoulder underneath his elbow. I'm going to lift his elbow up. Okay? Sometimes I'll do that and I'll trap his wrist in my armpit. Sometimes his wrist is a little bit lower and I'm just trapping it with my elbow. But I want to make sure that he can't start to pummel his arm in front of my arm. Okay, that's going to start causing problems for me. He got his arm back. I want to maintain control of his arm. So his arm stays in my armpit and I grab his tricep. Now, I'm going to roll my left hip forwards into his armpit and switch my base. My left hip comes forward into his armpit. My knee comes to his head. I get my crossface back. I bring my knee back to his hip, and I sit back down. And now what you've seen I've done is I've claimed his arm. And when I was down here, his arm was able to get inside of my hip, and he could push me away with it. He could frame, he could use it to shrimp and re-guard, and I don't want any of that. So what I did was I brought his arm really high. Now, if Mike tries to bring it back, I've trapped it. It's very difficult for him to get his arm back. I'm going to grab his shoulder. I'm going to grab his armpit. My right hand grabs his shoulder. My left hand grabs his armpit. I bring my head forward a little bit again, and I'm lifting his shoulder up off the ground as I slide the tip of my knee beneath his shoulder blade. In order to make space in this position, Mike wants to bring his elbow in between the two of us. Okay? He wants to get that elbow back in my hip. He's going to use that to keep me in place while he shrimps out. Go ahead. Okay. That's going to come from him being able to frame on my hip. Come back. When I pick Mike's shoulder up off the ground and I put just the tip of my knee under his shoulder, it's very difficult for him to bring his elbow into my hip. Once he gets his shoulder to the ground, his elbow gets in very easily. So whenever I get to this high scarf, I grab his armpit, I pull his shoulder off the ground, and I put the tip of my knee under his shoulder blade. Okay? Now I still want to keep this arm up in my armpit. My right elbow, I want it to be nice and close to his floating rib. It's not about how hard I can squeeze him. It's about preventing him from running away from me. Instead of me trying to move Mike, I'm just putting a wall in front of where he wants to go. So I put my elbow in his floating rib and I drop it to the floor. This is going to serve the job of controlling his hip. If my elbow were to come back to Mike's hip and Mike tries to shrimp, his hips will go right through my elbow. But if I put my elbow right at his floating rib, when Mike goes to try and shrimp, it's very painful. It's a very uncomfortable proposition, and I'm so high that he actually just brings me with him. Instead of his hips creating space, they just drag me around. I start in side control. I've got a crossface. I have an underhook. My knee is blocking his hip. My other knee is up high by his head. I reach underneath. I grab his elbow and I drive it into his body by bringing my head forwards. I'm going to switch my base and put my knee right by his shoulder blade. I can increase my pressure quite a bit by taking my floating rib and adjusting it inside of his floating rib. Now I take my hips off the ground and he's carrying all of my weight on his ovaries. Or his diaphragm. I always forget which one. Either way, it's super uncomfortable. It feels like you're gonna pop his organs. Connect your floating rib to their floating rib. It'll feel like you're stealing their soul. I'm gonna roll my left hip forward into his armpit to get to a nice high side control. You see that shoulder way up in my armpit? I'm gonna get my cross face. I switch my base back over. My elbow goes inside of my own thigh to isolate that arm from the rest of his body. Now I'm gonna go back to scarf. So I'm gonna grab that armpit. I bring my head forward. I take my floating rib back to his floating rib. I pick his shoulder up off the ground and I slide the tip of my knee under just his shoulder blade. Okay? My right elbow is by his floating rib to prevent him from stripping away. My right knee is beneath his shoulder blade to prevent him from getting his right elbow inside of my hip and defending this position. Okay? My head stays nice and low so that he can't grab my head with his leg. Other leg. That's going to be terrible for me. I don't want that at all. So my head stays nice and low. And I bring this leg, this foot, nice and close. That's going to help me keep track of that arm. Okay? Remember when I said I didn't want his arm to swim around in front of my face? I can use my hip to keep that arm there. There's only one direction his arm can go now. It can come up. Yeah. His arm can come right over the top of this. So my armpit sits on the top and my hip controls the bottom of this. My hips come just barely off the ground to put all of my weight on him. So I'm standing on my left toes, my right elbow, and then my floating rib is driving down into his floating rib. Matter of fact, that's gonna be an even better spot, right? Alright.
Thanks for studying at Straddle School. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. This time and every time, thank you for being here.